Good morning, everyone. I trust you all had a good evening, and welcome to the final day of our conference. Shall we start this final day with some big, ugly questions? Artificial intelligence and the future of mankind. Some of those big questions about how we can harness the ongoing technological revolution for good and manage its risks. And who better to help us answer those questions than Professor Nick Bostrom, Director of the Future of Humanity Institute and Director of the Strategic Artificial Intelligence Research Centre at Oxford University. Nick, we're all very much looking forward to hearing your presentation, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. So we're going to zoom out a little bit and have a glance at the really big picture question. We'll see if we get the... there. So this thing here, it's a sort of slightly it's a preposterously named multidisciplinary research group. We are computer scientists, mathematicians, philosophers, engineers, trying to look at not so much what might next year's iPhone be like, but are there things on the horizon that could, in some sense, fundamentally change the human condition, change the basic rules of the game. And a major focus of ours over the last number of years has been machine intelligence, which I think is a prime candidate for the next thing that will make a fundamental difference. And so you've all heard a little bit about this in the media, and there is a lot of excitement or hype, depending on how you view it, and one kind of reaches back into history to try to find some analog. What would it be like if we could really mechanize intelligence? Would it be like the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution? Something that shows up, as most things do not do, but these are arguably the only two events in all of human history that shows up if you run a plot of world GDP or world population. Even calamities like the world wars or the Spanish influenza, they wouldn't even show up if you just have a graph. But these would. They ushered in a fundamentally new economic regime, first with the agricultural revolution, where humans settled down and began to have cities with higher population density, specialization, social stratification, states that could collect taxes, social inequalities, wars, and things started happening more rapidly after that. And then with the Industrial Revolution, just a few hundred years ago, a real blink in the eye from a broad historical perspective, but where for the first time ever, economic growth became more rapid than population growth. So before that, you've had a lot of economic growth, but whenever the economy grew 10%, the population grew 10%. So you were still in a Malthusian condition through all of human history, except in the aftermath of some big calamity where the population could kind of temporarily have more land than was needed. But all of human history up until recently, and all of really the animal kingdom, is basically in a Malthusian condition. So that stopped with the Industrial Revolution. So now the economy grew so rapidly that even though the population also grew rapidly, it just couldn't quite keep up. So the Industrial Revolution was really a combination of different technologies, but if we simplify it greatly, we can think it's kind of the mechanization of labor with the steam engine and so forth. Muscle could now be done by internal combustion and gears and such. So if we manage to do something analogous like to the brain and thinking, what would that be like? Would that be another industrial revolution? Now, you could make the case that, in fact, to find some analog to what that would mean, you have to go back even further to the rise of Homo sapiens in the first place, because we would really be bringing into existence an entirely new substrate for thinking and for inventing. It's not just one specific technology, but it's changing the thing from which other technologies and ideas for social organization would come from. And in fact, you could make the case that it would be even bigger still, because if we kind of think about what was involved in the rise of our species, it involved some scaling up of a great ape ancestor brain, maybe by a factor of 3 or so, and some small neuronal changes in the wiring diagram, but not too many. We know that because it takes a very, very long time for complex new mechanisms to evolve. So some relatively small tweaks and the slight scaling up made the difference between great apes and our curious species. And the difference between the human brain and what might, at technological maturity, constitute machine brains could be much, much, much bigger. There are fundamental limits to information processing in biological substrate. For a start, there is a size limitation. It has to fit inside the skull, whereas a machine intelligence can be any size. It can be the size of a warehouse, or in the long run, it could be the size of a planet. There are also limitations in terms of processing speed. So a neuron can fire sustainably at maybe max 100 times a second, 100 hertz, whereas even current-day transistors can operate at gigahertz speed. Signals travel slowly in biological tissue, so you have nerve signals can travel down the spine at 100 meters per second. That's kind of the top speed. Whereas in computers, they can go at the speed of light. So we know that ultimately information processing in machine substrate just has vastly more potential. So if that were reflected in the effective performance of these systems, then the difference could potentially be more profound than the rise of our species. So let us ask, and I'll speak for some little time on this, and then I'll try to do what is one of the most difficult things for an academic to do, which is to shut up, so we can have time for question and answers. So this is what artificial intelligence used to be, and this, I think, still shapes many people's intuitions about what AI is. So AI used to be, in the 60s and 70s and even 80s, about constructing expert systems. So you would sit down with some human domain expert and try to extract the knowledge and write principles, general statements, usually of the form, if you see X, Y, and Z, then do this particular action. If you see something else, then do that. And so you have a big database, and all the AI really was the ability to make simple logical deductions from this. But you got out only what you had put in. So these systems were very brittle. They didn't scale very well, expensive to maintain. A few narrow applications, but really not very world-changing. And another thing that this kind of good old-fashioned AI was good at was solving some simple games where you could explicitly articulate the rules. So logical puzzles like this one. I had one of those Rubik's Cube when I was little. So things like that, they were good at. But really completely blind, no intuition, no real creativity. So that started to change about 7 years ago with the advances that I think you've all seen about with deep learning, creating these multi-layered neural networks. And what became possible for the first time is really to do perception in a machine. So these are some early examples. This is from a few years back, where you can present one of these deep neural nets with a picture, which to the AI is just an array of numbers representing the color brightness at each pixel, right? And then they can look at that and make some educated guess about what is in the picture. You might think, didn't Google have image search further back than that? Like you could, well, yeah, they did, but it used to work in a different way. So the way that it was done before was Google would go to all these web pages, and it would see picture, and maybe the caption would have something about cat, and the page would talk a lot about cat. So it would guess maybe this is a picture of a cat, but it wouldn't actually look at the picture to do that determination. So what these neural networks do is they can actually look at the picture and see. And you can run them in reverse, and you can get a kind of hallucination thing. So you can kind of generate as well as classify, get these creepy ones. They also seem to have some sense for style, like visual intuition about an artist's style. And so you can put in a photograph and a painting and have it generate the photograph in the style of the artist. So here is like a Van Gogh, and you can do a waterfall. It looks kind of a little bit. So this is the kind of thing that would not have been possible with good old-fashioned AI, because it wouldn't have been possible to write down an explicit set of rules. What counts as a picture being a picture of a cat. Like, what possible combination of pixel brightness values would constitute a cat? That's just hopeless. Or try to distill the essence of Van Gogh's brushwork. So more recently, you can do these kind of style transfer, where you can have an AI that is fed in a little video sequence like that, and it can kind of capture the essence of that and then imagine what that would look like if it had been a zebra instead. So you feed in the word zebra and this little video, and it kind of dreams up or imagines this sequence that you see here on the right. And if you look at the tail, you can see that there are some artifacts. It's not 100% perfect. You can get it to dream or imagine things that don't exist. So the same kind of networks that are able to classify this, if you construct them in a certain way, you can get them to generate not just pictures, but video sequences. So these are variations on the theme beach. You can create arbitrary numbers of these, just these. They're not exactly 100% accurate, but they're certainly evocative. Or if you give it the word golf, you will get something like this. So this is work from, I think, about 1.5, 2 years ago, so quite recent. Very much the same architecture can be applied to other sensor modalities as well. You can do sound. Let's see if this works. So this is music composed by these generative adversarial networks. It's not Beethoven or anything. It's actually quite bad. I mean, if you only hear, if you hear 2 or 3 seconds, it sounds kind of good. But if you listen to a longer string, you sort of realize there is no structure, no meaning, no movement. It doesn't have. So these networks are very good at texture, kind of local texture, but don't really have a very good conception of architectural composition at the moment. And that's also, if you remember a few slides back, that we're looking hallucinogenic picture with a lot of eyes. The inceptionist network, the reason why it gets so many eyes is that it doesn't really have a counting sense. So the texture, the dog fur, kind of looks realistic in parts of the image. But one of the things that have caused this excitement are now it's possible for computers to see and hear, and indeed to some extent generate images and video sequences. So this is a big breakthrough, like kind of solve perception. There's a lot more work to be done to make it really work. But it creates a new set of basic capabilities that you can then try to build interesting things with. And another advance recently, this you've all seen, I'm sure, from a couple of years ago as well, is with reinforcement learning. So this is a set of techniques that allow you to train an artificial agent, which is something that performs actions. So a classifier kind of just looks at an image and attaches a label, but what you can also do is to train an agent to perform some skills. So in this case, with the DeepMind's work, they trained an agent to play Atari games. And it starts out not knowing anything about the game. All it gets is a sequence of these matrices of pixel values coming in, one for every screenshot. And it can do trial and error. It gets the score as well. It doesn't know the rules of this game. But it just kind of fiddles around and see what works. And after doing this for a while, it gets quite good at it. And so what's interesting with this is not that you could create an artificial intelligence to learn to play Breakout. That would have been possible with good old-fashioned AI as well. But that you could create a single algorithm that can learn to play a wide range of different Atari games right out of the box without a human having to figure out how to do it. So this is the fundamental transformation from building databases to building learning algorithms, algorithms that can develop complex representations or complex skills. And more recently, you can do a similar kind of thing in three-dimensional environments. All the agent gets in is a sequence of pictures, which is just numbers, and then it can kind of learn from trial and error to start to navigate mazes and solve simple problems there. And so there's now this burgeoning of research interest with the big technical conferences growing exponentially year on year, big investment pouring into this area. All the big tech companies have kind of established AI labs, and a lot of talent getting sucked into this. Like when I was a student, the kind of the high prestige thing that the cream of the cream wanted to maybe go into string theory, like theoretical physics was sort of seen as the queen of science, where you wanted to be. And now I think a lot of the same people think AI is where they want to be. And that's one of the reasons why I think that there might be exciting things ahead as well, because this amount of talent and investment going into the field, I think will just accelerate things a lot. So those are some of the new kinds of components that have happened. Now, so here are some big remaining challenges. To get all the way to full human intelligence, you need more effective learning. You need, in particular, better algorithms for unsupervised learning. So supervised learning is, say, if you have a big data set of pictures and you have labels attached, you can train the network. Unsupervised learning is when you don't have a teacher that tells you what the correct label is or what the correct behavior is. So we humans learn a lot from unsupervised learning. If you think about it, you have a baby comes into the world, and after 20 years, maybe it can do something useful. And yes, there was some explicit instruction in there. Sometimes the parents say, no, don't do it like that. This is how you do it. But most of the learning we just learn by observing the world and by playing around without any explicit instructions. So most of what we know comes from unsupervised learning. We need better ways to do that. One-shot learning, so I can tell you something once or twice, and then you know it. You don't have to see 1,000 examples. If I show you a picture of an animal you've never seen before, 1 or 2 pictures, you can probably recognize that animal. So that needs to be done better. Better transfer learning, which is the ability to use insights you get from learning about one domain to then more quickly learn about another domain. And there are rudimentary ways of doing that now, but it needs to happen more effectively. And then reasoning. This is something that so far these neural nets are not doing. They're more perceptual intuition modules. So on top of that, probably you need to build something that has more flexible attention structures and memory structures that can have complex representations that can be recombined in different ways, a bit like we do when we reason verbally. That might then enable natural language understanding, and then better deep hierarchical planning and reinforcement learning. So when we try to solve some complex task, we don't just randomly try different things until something works. We can kind of think what the goal is and then reason backwards. We're backwards chaining. So if I want to be back in Oxford later today, I'll have to take the train there. So I have to go to the train station. So how do I get there? I'll need a car to the train station, and then so I can reason backwards from goal. That's also something that hasn't really been done. So there are a number of these profound challenges that remain, but also a lot of research and talent going into the field to make progress on this. So one might wonder what actually is the timescale here. If we will eventually figure out how the brain produces intelligence and be able to reproduce that in machines, or produce machine intelligence through other means, but we can't do it now. Just how far away are we? And so we did a survey of some of the world's leading machine learning experts, and one question we asked was formulated in terms of this concept. We defined high-level machine intelligence as the intelligence we have when a machine can accomplish every task better and more cheaply than human workers. Aside if we just decide that you have to be a human to be a judge or a priest or something, but all functionally specified tasks. So this is true general human-level AI that we asked about, not just some specific kind of domain-specific. So one of the questions we asked was, by which year do you think there is a 50% probability that we will have attained this high-level, human-level machine intelligence? So this represents the responses. The red line here shows the median opinion among this expert community. And you can see that if you're asking, for example, by which year do you think there is a 50% probability that we will have attained this milestone, you have to go out to roughly 45 years. So the median opinion is that in 40 to 45 years, there's a 50% probability that human-level AI will have been achieved. If you're asking, say, by which year is there 25% chance, as you can see here, maybe 20 years from now. So this, it's certainly not the case that nobody who is expert in the field takes seriously the hypothesis that this might happen soonish, within the lifetime of a lot of people today. Like that's just some kind of science fiction, like, or people who don't know their stuff. And this is the median opinion in the field. These faint lines in the background represent individual respondents' probability distribution, some subset of them. And as you can see, they are all over the map. There are people who are convinced that this will certainly happen within 10, 15, 20 years. And there are other people who are absolutely convinced that it will never happen, and anything in between as well. So there is no consensus about the timelines for this. And I think the truth of the matter is that we just don't know. It's very difficult to predict. We can kind of see that one or more basic technical breakthroughs will have to happen. We don't know exactly how many, and we don't know how long each of those breakthroughs will take. And so that what we should do is think in terms of some probability distributions smeared out over a wide range of possible arrival dates, and just acknowledge that we can't make a very precise forecast as to when this could happen. But that there is, nevertheless, it seems, a significant chance of it happening within the lifetime of a lot of currently existing people. So just lastly, one might quickly ask, what are the possible outcomes if we do develop, and when we do develop, general artificial intelligence? And I think that this question is easier to answer, which is, I think, after we develop human-level machine intelligence, we will develop superintelligence. It just seems very unlikely that we will kind of get all the way up to the full repertoire of things that we humans can do, and then it will screech to a halt there. It seems much more likely, and I can elaborate on the reasons why I think that perhaps soon after we reach human level, we will have something that is radically super intelligent and just better at all cognitive tasks than we humans are. And I think that will be a kind of fundamental discontinuity. I wrote a book about this a couple of years ago that came out. And the book really focuses in on this. I think I will pause there, but I'm happy to take it in whichever direction you want to go. So that's all I have. Thank you.
That wasn't my book review, Nick, honestly. I felt quite concerned halfway through your book when you started to talk about some of the risks, but yeah, it got very much better as we talked about how we might mitigate it. I've got some questions coming through on the app, so just a reminder that you can put your questions through that way. I'll also take some questions from the floor if we have any at the moment. Okay, I wanted to ask, oh, sorry, we've got one up there actually, number 4, please.
Thank you, that was very interesting. What personally do you think presents a bigger challenge for humanity in the future out of machine intelligence and climate change?
Machine intelligence.
Thank you.
I'll tell you, Nick, that wins the prize for best answer of the week.
I could elaborate. I mean, so I think that climate change is a fairly well understood problem. It happens slowly over a timescale of a century or something like that. And the end result is fairly well understood. It gets a little bit warmer. And AI, on the other hand, is something that might happen abruptly, that involves creating something entirely different than has ever existed, like bringing into the world something that is smarter than we are. And yet, we have to engineer it in such a way that we can still predict what it will do and control it. So how do you bring into the world something that is super intelligent and that will still be on your side, not just initially, but because intelligence is a very, very powerful thing. That's why it's us humans kind of running the show now, and not the gorillas. They're much stronger, right? So,
yeah.
And it has a kind of open-ended creativity. So all further technological progress is then driven by this. That might invent all kinds of technologies that we literally can't conceive of. And we got to get it right on the first try, because once you have a super intelligent adversary, I think the game is over, right? So we are not very good at anticipating challenges and acting in advance to solve them, and particularly we're not very good at doing difficult, complex things and getting it all right on the first attempt. And then this involves additional things, because it has to do with the mind, with creativity, with soul, like these kind of things that we get confused about, free will. So that looks like a bigger, both more difficult challenge, and also I think the stakes are higher.
Which makes me wonder, Nick, about the excellent graph you showed, showing when experts think human-level AI will be attained. It looked a bit like possible pathways through the Brexit negotiations, the level of uncertainty on there. But it makes me think, if there is no consensus and no agreement among the experts, what are the signs we might be looking out for that tell us we're, within a 5 or 10 year horizon?
That is a very interesting question, because it's not obvious that there will be any such signs. It depends a little bit on what the bottlenecks are. So you could imagine a scenario where there would be advanced warnings. So this is if the AI is hardware constrained. So then you would basically figure out how to run a human mind, or something like a human mind, but it would be very, very slow. It would use one of these big server clouds, and it would be maybe 10,000 times slower than a human. Would have some of the same. So then you could see that, well, it's going to get a little bit faster, and we're going to build bigger computers, so eventually we will get there, and we'll get a lot of advanced warning. But it could also be that you have to have 10 things, 10 ingredients for this thing really to work, and you have 9 of them. It still doesn't really work. It can do some things. It can look at pictures and see what's in them, and it can play Go, but it has no ability to understand natural language, let's say. And then when you put in that last missing piece, suddenly it kind of clicks into place and it works. In that kind of scenario, it's not clear that you would see it coming at all. Like maybe the research group building it gets really excited, and a few weeks later they have it figured out. What that suggests is that as a civilization, we shouldn't sort of sit back and do nothing until we get a clear warning sign, and then kick into action and start doing the research on how to make these things safe. But we should kind of get cracking on that today, I think.
I'm going to keep hold of your phone number, Nick, to make sure. Question number 1 there.
We've got roles for robotics like Asimov. We've all got the doom and gloom movies that we've seen there where AI takes over the world and what have you. How do we govern AI that we don't see someone exploiting it?
Yeah, so I think that, broadly speaking, one can kind of divide the AI challenge into 3 broad challenges. So one is a technical challenge. That is, how do you engineer this kind of hypothetical future superintelligence so that it does what we intend for it to do? This is ultimately a computer science challenge. Now, if we can solve that, then you have the economic and political governance challenge. Like, what do we do with this very powerful technology? And who decides? And if we can solve that too, we have a kind of the third challenge, which is like the purpose problem. What do we do with our lives once we no longer have to work? And so this second challenge, I think, is quite profound. And the kinds of answers that would be relevant depends very much on the temporal context we're considering. So if we're talking about this kind of full human level / superintelligence, I think that's one context. I think there's a different set of issues that arise with the kind of techniques we currently have, where very, very different set. I mean, right now people are worrying about maybe privacy and surveillance or algorithmic discrimination and so forth, unemployment. Whereas with this kind of hypothetical future breakthrough, it becomes a strategic matter as well. And we don't really know the answers to that. People have only recently started doing more systematic analysis of some of these policy questions. One observation I would make is that if it succeeds, the amount of wealth that is created is enormous. The size of the pie grows vastly in this kind of regime where you have the ability to replace human labor with machine labor cheaply. It's 70% of the world economy is income for labor, right? So it's a big sector. So there is still the question of how to divide it, but at least you're facing the problem of how to divide a enormously increasing pie. And so that if we could, maybe whilst we're still behind the veil of ignorance, because nobody knows today who will be inventing this, like which country, which company. While we're still behind a veil of ignorance, if we could kind of embed an assumption, a principle that AI should be for the common good of all, I'm talking here about superintelligence. If it's ever developed, everybody will share in the risk. We're all humans on this planet. Everybody should have at least some stake in the upside as well, if it goes well. That's consistent with there being incentive for developers to apply all the intermediate results and maybe get a bigger slice. But the pie would be so big that even if just some fraction of that were sort of carved out for the common good, there would be plenty to go around. So I would try to urge the world to try to take a cooperative approach to this, where we see it as a big challenge that we all have in common, rather than think of it in narrow factionalist terms. And there is actually appetite for that so far. I mean, maybe because it's still so far that there's no business plan sort of relying on developed superintelligence and then transform the universe into a great palace for the owners. So among the AI developer community, there's a big desire to feel that they're working on something that is good and responsible. And a lot of people prefer to work for groups or companies that make that commitment. So I think there might be an opportunity to get that embedded, that kind of norm.
One of the things we've heard a few times in discussion at conference this week is how it's things like economics and politics and governance which will determine how technological developments affect us, whether they're benign or a force for good or a force for bad. In your view, is enough being done outside of the scientific community to think about what some of the implications of superintelligence might be and how we manage them?
I don't think enough. It's still very, very new. I mean, it used to be, even so the reason I wrote this book was that there was a number of people trying to develop AI, but nobody really thinking about what would happen if they were to succeed. So a lot of the book focuses on these more technical, the control problem, alignment problem, how you can engineer this artificial system to be aligned with human interest. Now, since then, there has started springing up a research field around precisely that problem of scalable control methods. Mm-hmm. Now we can kind of see that there are these additional problems, governance problem. But our thinking on that is roughly where our thinking on the alignment problem was 2 or 3 years back. You can kind of see that there is a problem there to be solved, but it's not quite clear what the right questions to ask are or what the right concepts to use to analyze this. So we are just setting up a program on this at Oxford, and there are a number of other groups that are starting to look into that. Mm-hmm. I think, and I would say though that it is actually not totally obvious that, so I said I think we're not doing enough, and I think that's my guess on balance. It's not entirely obvious that it is actually good to do more. I think it is, but I'm not. I could imagine somebody running the argument the other way, which could either be that if it's important that we have a cooperative approach to this, maybe by having clearer foresight into some of these things, it would tend to stimulate arms races or tech races and kind of whet the appetite if they see this like a big lever of power, like maybe, so that could be undesirable. Also, another thing you could say is that we humans are so bad at thinking ahead about problems and trying to prepare for them long in advance that it's better that we don't even try. Like we'll just, if we try to make decisions when to most people these things are still science fiction things, it's going to maybe just be shaped by our ideology or prejudices. Whereas when we get closer, you can see more the concrete details and it becomes more real and maybe you can make more sensible.
But we have to balance that against the risk that you described earlier,
yes.
that we might not see it coming.
I still think on balance, probably I would like to see more discussion and research on this.
Okay, thank you. Number 3, sorry John to keep you waiting.
That's all right. Hi. One of the key differentiating factors between humans, even super intelligent humans, is the extent to which they have emotional intelligence. To what extent do you think you'll be able to, in the future, actually embed notions of emotional intelligence into AI?
So I think when I'm talking about superintelligence here, is I really mean the whole gamut of all the things we can say, including scientific creativity, social skills, general wisdom. So there are very limited ways in which you can do that. You could have a neural network that, say, at the very basic level is able to look at the face and see whether it looks angry or sad. So that's something you can do now. Then to have higher levels of emotional intelligence, you need to build up a more complex model of what the mind is, what the personality is. And that, I think, will happen more or less automatically as you get learning algorithms that are more effective at creating world models and building up predictive models to able to understand their sensory perceptions. So I think it will happen, and my guess is that it will happen more or less as a side effect of the things that need to happen anyway, just to get a very versatile, flexible, powerful learning ability.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple of questions from those coming in on the app now, and then there'll be time for a couple of more from the floor if anyone wants to get ready. Let me start with one about movies, actually, Nick. So somebody says, when I think of AI, I think about big movies like War Games, I, Robot, Ex Machina. I don't know if you've seen all or any of these, but all of them start off with AI being a positive thing for mankind, but ultimately it turns out to be bad. What are your kind of thoughts on that representation of AI in popular culture?
Well, so in general, to have a story, something has to go wrong. Like you can't have 2-hour feature film, everything worked out well, everybody were happy and lived in peace and harmony.
It's like us in the pensions industry trying to deal with the media. Something has to go wrong. Yeah.
So it's not I think not the best source of science fiction in general, and particularly sort of mass public science fiction, Hollywood movies, not the best source of insight on the future, because I mean, it's hard enough to get the future right, even if all you're trying to do is to get the future right. But if simultaneously you're also trying to tell a really entertaining story with roles for the actors that have been designated, have to have starring roles in different ways, and then it just adds a level of difficulty that is unnecessary. And so if you're optimizing for being maximally entertaining, you're probably not going to be optimizing simultaneously for maximally plausible. The main first big obstacle to thinking constructively about these kinds of topics is our tendency to anthropomorphize AI, to immediately think of them as though the AI was a human, maybe a sort of slightly autistic human, but with all the same emotional dispositions and propensity. So we think if a human came into possession of great power, that maybe they would be corrupted. Or we know that if a human were treated badly and enslaved and exploited for a while, maybe they will build up a resentment. Like these things, there might be good psychological observations about human nature, but there's just no reason to assume that they would have to be there in a machine intelligence where you just maybe construct the motivation system from the ground up. So the first thing I would recommend is to sort of clear the slate of all human psychology, and then start to sort of build up from the ground up your concepts and understanding about these artificial.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, I guess it's about sort of feedback loops, really. And do you think AI will be detrimental to human skill over time? So might we become too reliant on machine learning and lose some of our cognitive skills?
So if we're talking nearer term, I think as we automate various processes, we don't need to do those processes. So we don't learn how to do those. That frees us up to learn other things. So maybe there are fewer people who are able to operate a spinning jenny or a weaving thing now, but we can. So that's like first little piece of the answer. Then we can say, well, there are also opportunities to AI to sort of be applied to education, to maybe customize the learning experience to each student that could make us learn faster. Now, I think if we're talking about this future context where you really have superintelligence, then it's important to recognize superintelligence is not just one technology, it's not just AI, but it's really a general technological maturation that happens, a kind of telescoping of the future, if you will. So think of all those technologies that we humans could have maybe invented if we had, say, 20,000 years to work on the problem. Maybe then we would have a cure for aging and would have space colonies and all these kind of science fiction-like technologies that we know are consistent with the laws of physics. They're possible, just very, very, very hard. Like all of those things might happen very soon after you have a superintelligence that is doing this research and development on a digital timescale. So you think all of these ultimate technologies is happening quickly. Now, amongst those possible technologies would, I think, be technologies that would enhance human intelligence or transform the human brain in various ways, including ways that would make us more skillful and make us learn vastly faster, or perhaps with even more profound transformations, able to download knowledge and skills of different kinds. So in this radical context, you have a kind of plastic world where, in the limit, you could imagine anything you want to achieve that's consistent with laws of physics. You can just snap your fingers and have it happen, including having whatever subjective experience you want or whatever skills you want. So in that kind of world, it really then depends on what we would choose to do with these things. Would we still choose to acquire different skills, even though there was no instrumental benefit from having them? Maybe we place a final value on being able to do certain things ourselves, even though the AI could do them all better. In that case, there might be more skill. But if we think it would be preferable to, say, be a blob floating in a jacuzzi with a heroin drip or some better equivalent of that, if we, say, go for maximizing pleasure rather than maximizing skill, then you might get less. So you get, in some class of scenarios, you get the kind of future transformed into whatever it is that we would most prefer the future to be.
So a wonderful note to conclude on, I think. But I have got time to squeeze in a final question. If I've got one final question there, if we can just find time for that, Nick.
Simon Freeman, Pendragon. Just a domain question, really. We in this industry are very interested in the state of the markets, the financial markets. And I wondered if you could say something, if you have any views on what effect AI will have on financial markets, for example, the stock exchange. We've seen over the years the effect of computer-aided trading. It's had to be regulated a bit. I'm interested to know whether you think applying AI techniques to market would have strong effects on the market.
The first order effect would be to make them even more efficient, I think. So to the extent that you can, through pattern recognition algorithms, detect arbitrage opportunities and trade them away, I think you get a more efficient market. And this is obviously one early obvious application of some of these advances I'm not sure it would, that application in and of itself would, other than making maybe the people who happen to have the best algorithm wealthy, and making the market slightly more efficient, I'm not sure it will have a profound immediate impact on the markets. I mean, you could also ask, to the extent that one does get some advance warning, or it becomes more commonly believed that this transition to the machine intelligence era might happen within 5, 10, I mean, some number of years, how will that anticipation shape the market? Would it be possible, would there be certain, say, sectors or industries or companies that would become much more valuable if one believed that such a transition was imminent? And there are some obvious things one might think. You might think, for example, well, like the firms that make the right kind of chip to run these machines might see their stocks appreciate. If we look at NVIDIA, who's making these GPUs that's kind of fueling most of this machine learning, and AMD, they have, in fact, over the last few years, had their stock prices quadruple. And I think partly fueled by demand from big tech companies that build up server farms to run machine learning applications. Of course, there's also other sources of demand for these. So the same chips that are useful for machine learning are also useful for running graphics applications, so computer games and so forth. So it's hard to tease apart just how much of that demand for, say, NVIDIA products and therefore NVIDIA stock is due specifically to some subset of investors anticipating that there might be big demand for AI in the future versus, say, GPUs for video game consoles. But I think there's a significant amount of both. But if one day it sort of became generally believed that AI was going to happen 2 years from now, then you would expect that some of those assets would become very valuable.
Okay, that is really all we have time for, I'm afraid. But thank you, Nick. That's been tremendously thought-provoking, a great way to start the final day of our conference.
Thank you for the question.